may have noticed on the back of the announcement sheet, that bottom corner gives the lesson for today, and it says, widows that matter to Jesus. And that is really kind of a outgrowth of one lesson that I wanted to do that has changed over the week as I began to study some different things. I originally wanted to do a lesson from Luke chapter 7 about the widow from Nain who Jesus brought her son back from the dead. We are going to briefly mention her today, but as I was studying that a little bit, I read a statement that said in the book of Luke that there are 4 widows who are mentioned, and even possibly a 5th one. The 5th possible widow may be the mother-in-law of Peter. It's not said for sure that she was a widow, but it's possible that she was. But setting her aside, because we don't know with absolute certainty, there are 4 widows who are mentioned in the book of Luke. And this morning, we want to spend a little bit of time learning a lesson or two from each one of those 4 instances where a widow is mentioned by Jesus or has an encounter with Jesus in the book of Luke. And as we look and we study this, I look over this audience and I think about other congregations that I've been a part of, and I think about many friends that I have had through the years in the circle of Christianity. And I know a great many widows who are members of the Lord's kingdom. And every congregation is indebted to many of the women who are widows in the respective congregations because of the great work that they do. And I thank the many great things that you do for the kingdom of Christ and the cause of the Lord in the situation that you find yourself in. Yesterday, Servando Flores came to my house. I had 2 trees at my house that had been damaged by storms, and we needed to cut those down. And we cut down a 3rd one that was a little too close to the house, and we drug all that stuff to the side of the road, and we did all this. It took about 4 hours to do all this. And I tell you, I thought after we did all that today, at this congregation, because I didn't know if I was going to make it or not. But I'm thankful and grateful that we were able to get some great things done and accomplish that, and that, yes, indeed, I still am here today. So, as we think about widows that are mentioned in the book of Luke, for our first one, we're going to turn to Luke chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, we find a lady named Anna. And this is the New Testament equivalent of the Old Testament name Hannah. But we find a lady named Anna when Jesus was being brought to the temple to be dedicated because he was the firstborn of Mary. And when we look at Luke chapter 2 at verse 36, the text tells us this. Now there was one, Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phinehas of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. And this woman was a widow of about 84 years, who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gave thanks to the Lord and spoke of him, Jesus, who had already been brought there by his parents, and spoke of him to all those who look for redemption in Jerusalem. Not much is said about Anna. Very little information do we have about her. And yet we do know that she was a widow, and so from Anna, this is what we're going to learn. Praise and proclamation. Actually, 2 very brief lessons there. From Anna, we're going to learn praise and proclamation. As you look at what the text says about her, her age, well, it's a little hard to calculate because it depends on if the 84 that is mentioned there was her age then, or it was how long she had been a widow. It's debatable as to which way that could be translated. If she'd been a widow for 84 years, this would obviously put her probably well over 100 years of age. But I think that regardless of what direction we may go with this, we have to remember that the Bible says here in verse 36, she was of great age. So she was not a young lady. She had apparently been widowed as a young lady. Her husband did not live very long. Apparently they were only married for 7 years when he died. And she never married again. And so all these many years later, still unmarried, still a widow, she is of great age. And she spent her life in fastings, in prayers, and not departing from the temple day or night. And so she gave the remainder of her life service to the God that she loved. And although she was a widow, she was still devoted to God's service. And she still was fully involved in worship and all the things connected with the temple. You see, there's a lesson there, even very specifically for widows, that there's still much for widows and widowers to do in the kingdom of God. Just because these difficult circumstances may have happened does not mean that there is nothing for someone in that situation to do. We find this lady was doing this to, I guess you all might almost say, the extreme, night and day. She never left the temple, but long as you look at the lesson we learned from here, praise and proclamation. You could add to that prayer as well, because it says fastings and prayers, and those often go together. But praise and proclamation. And notice it says in verse 38 that when she came in, she saw the baby Jesus there. He's only about 40 days old at this point, and that she gave thanks to the Lord. She gave thanks to the Lord. So she gave praise to God. Now, apparently Anna has a little bit of insight into this situation that maybe not just everybody has. Kind of like Simeon that's mentioned in the verses before her, who had been told that he would not pass away until he saw the consolation of Israel, until he saw the Messiah. And apparently Anna had some kind of inside information about this, because remember the text says she was a prophetess. So she was endowed with some kind of supernatural gift to know when she saw that baby that this wasn't just any old ordinary baby that was being brought to the temple. This was the Messiah. She gave thanks for him, praise. And then I want you to notice the idea of proclamation when you read the rest of verse 38. And spoke of him to all those who look for redemption in Jerusalem. So she praised God about him. And then what did she do next? She spoke of him to everyone that she saw. To everyone that was looking for the redemption through the Messiah that was yet to come. She was now able to tell them, being a prophetess, he's here. He has arrived. Praise and proclamation. We learn that no matter who we are, no matter what our state of life is, whether married, widowed, single, or whatever the situation may be, we can praise God and we can proclaim a message about Jesus, the Messiah. And so from this lady, this lady of very great age, of whom we know very little, learn to praise and learn to proclaim the message of Jesus. The second widow that is mentioned in the book of Luke is the widow of Nain in Luke chapter 7. The Bible tells us in Luke chapter 7 that Jesus is on one of his ministry circuits, going about preaching and teaching to various situations and various places and various people. And when we come to verse 11 of Luke chapter 7, we read these words. Now it happened the day after he was come to the city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he had come near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion, and he said to her, do not weep. Then he came and touched the open, and those who carried him stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up, began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. And then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us. We think about this widow who finds herself in a very difficult situation. She's a widow, and in that day and time, widows often depended upon their husband for their livelihood. And so when a husband died, it was incumbent upon the family to care for the widow. Well, she only had one son, and this is probably the son that was taking care of her in her widowhood. But now what's happened to him? He's passed away. Her future possibly is very, very bleak. And it may be that her only source of livelihood, income, comfort, and even a home died when her only son died. And yet, this widow of Nain, we learn the Lord's power. We learn about the Lord's power. Like I said at the beginning of this lesson, originally I wanted to do a lesson today just about this widow, but it's developed into more than just her. And yet there's still much more about her that I would like to say than we're going to say just in these couple of moments we study about Luke chapter 7. So as I've developed this lesson that I'm presenting today, I've also kind of been side-developing another lesson on her. And so, Lord willing, next Sunday, we're going to look at her again, more lessons from this. And we're not only going to look at her, but there's another woman that is mentioned in the latter part of Luke chapter 7, a woman who is forgiven by Jesus. And just as a preview for next Sunday's lesson, we're going to look at both of these ladies and their connection with Jesus and what Jesus did for both of them. But now back to what the point that we want to make today, that from this incident here, this lady, this widow of Nain, we learn about the Lord's power. The funeral and burial customs of that day and time were very different from what we are accustomed to now. You see, when someone died at that day and time, often they were buried that same day. Often it was very immediate when someone was buried. You may recall that when Jesus died on the cross, they took him down from the cross, and Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea prepared his body and buried it the same day. That was not an unusual custom in that day and time, because they did not embalm bodies and so on, and they simply buried a body as quickly as they could before the decomposition began to take place. And that's exactly what we see going on here in all likelihood. They're taking this man who had died to be buried right then. And Jesus, by the way, this is not a coincidence that Jesus just happened to be there, but Jesus comes walking into the city. There are people who try to discount the miracle here of raising the son from the dead. There are people who say, because it was probably the same day, really he probably wasn't dead. Obviously he had been sick or something, and perhaps he had become almost comatose, and they thought he was dead, and so they're taking him out, and Jesus just simply happened to be in the right place at the right time, and it looked like he raised him from the dead. Well, the Bible tells us that there's a whole multitude of people with this widow who were eyewitnesses of this. The critics who say that were not eyewitnesses, but there were eyewitnesses of that who said what? The guy's dead. So that there's really, he hadn't been dead long apparently, but there's no doubt in my mind that this man was dead and that Jesus brought him back from the dead. And from that we learn his power. We learn about the Lord's power, and really we learn about his power in two ways. First of all, we learn about his power with his feelings, and we learn about his power to give and restore life. As you think about the feelings of Jesus, the text tells us that as they were bringing this funeral procession was coming out of the city, verse 13 says, the Lord saw her. He knew the situation, obviously. He had compassion on her. And he told her, do not weep. Obviously, she was weeping, and we understand why. She was crying. And for just a moment, you might think how heartless to walk up to a widow at the funeral procession of her only son and say, don't cry, stop crying. because Jesus knew what he was about to do. And we see the power of Jesus' feelings, that he had compassion, that he heard for this woman. And we understand that the Bible tells us, maybe in a slightly different context, but in Hebrews chapter 4, that we do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with our infirmities. He can be. He's touched with our weaknesses, our infirmities. He has feelings for us because he created us and he loves us. And so we learn about the power of Jesus' heart, the power of Jesus' feelings. But we also learn about the power of Jesus to give life and to restore life. And on this occasion, of course, he brings this young man back from the dead. I think this is the first resurrection from the dead that Jesus performed during his ministry. He did not do that very often, but I think this is the first one. And here he restored this young man to life. And while we can make many applications of that, we think about Judgment Day, and one day there'll be a restoring of all life to all people, and there's ultimately all eternity. I want us to think about that he can give life to us right now, spiritually speaking, when we obey the gospel. He can restore our soul. Psalm 23, verse 3, he restores my soul. He can restore our soul. He can make it new and alive again when we obey the gospel. When we put away sin, we have the sin washed away in the waters of baptism, and we rise from the waters of baptism to walk faithfully in the new life of Christ. Then we have new life. We have restoration. And that can be ours for all eternity. Even if we die physically, we will live forever spiritually. And we learn that as we think, or we can think about that, we learn that when we think about this lady and we learn about the Lord's power. Third widow in the book of Luke is in Luke chapter 18, and it's a parable. Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells a parable, and we begin reading at verse 1. Luke 18, verse 1. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. Some translations say, faint not, but it really means not lose heart. And here's the parable beginning in verse 2. There was a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterwards he said to himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. In the application, the Lord said, verse 6, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect that cry out to him day and night, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on earth? From this widow, the widow of the parable, we learn persistence in prayer. From this widow, we learn persistence in prayer. The purpose of the parable, verse 1, that we should always pray and not lose heart. There are many things that happen in this world that would cause us to lose heart. There are many things that would happen in this world, as some translations say, faint not, that would cause us to faint. There are many things that would make us weak and weary and discouraged. And we just lose heart. We faint. Jesus told this parable to encourage us not to faint, not to lose heart, not to quit, not to give up, but to be persistent and persistent in prayer. And as you look at the text, we learn from the application that Jesus makes, beginning in verse 6, that if a wicked judge, notice it says he didn't fear God, he didn't regard man, he was a selfish, wicked man. If a wicked judge will help someone who is persistent, then imagine what the just judge, the holy, righteous, sinless, perfect judge will do for his own people that he loves, that he regards, when we are persistent. Even, Jesus says, even the worst man will finally answer somebody just so they'll leave them alone. Imagine what our God will do for us and how he will answer and bless us when we are persistent with him. This unjust judge did not regard man, did not care for man. Our God does. He loves us. The problem often is not God's failure to give and bless. It's my failure to be persistent in asking. My failure to pray. Men ought always to pray and not lose heart. So we learn persistence in prayer. The fourth widow that is mentioned in the book of Luke, and the final one that we want to think about today, if you'll turn to Luke 21, toward the very end of Jesus' ministry, in fact, one of the last few days of Jesus' life, in verses 1 through 4, you read about a widow. Luke 21, verse 1. Jesus is in the temple, and he looked up and saw the rich pouring their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, "Truly, I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had." From this widow, we learn priority. Priority. You see, this was a widow who knew what was first. And even though Jesus said it was all that she had, it was just 2 small coins. It was not a large amount as far as the monetary value. And compared to the others, it was practically nothing. The others, it says, were putting in large gifts. They were rich. They were putting in much. She put, though, something more than they did. Not monetarily. Because you see, she put in her heart, her trust, her faith. And we must understand that God not only sees the portion, he sees the proportion as well. He sees not only what we give, but he sees what remains. What's the proportion of what we have given versus what we still have? Notice Jesus says, "These gave out of their abundance." They gave a lot, yes. You know, it would be a big dollar figure as far as the monetary value of it. They gave a lot, but they still had a whole lot left over. She gave little as far as the monetary value, but it was everything. It was all that she had. None of these rich men gave all that they had. The proportion was much smaller. It was not even couldn't even be compared because she gave everything because of the priority of heart that she had. She gave her heart first. And so to give all that she had was really nothing to her because she knew God would care for her. And as we think about this, God not only sees, what we give, but he sees what remains. Therefore, giving is measured not by the amount of the gift, the monetary value of the gift. Giving is measured by the heart. That's where real giving, that's where God takes the real benchmark for our giving. It's our heart. It's not the size of the gift may be tremendously huge. It's the heart. Have we given our heart? This widow gave nothing practically in terms of monetary value, but she gave everything. She gave her heart. And you know, there's something as I have thought about these widows that are mentioned in the book of Luke, there's something very interesting to observe and to know about these widows. Particularly this one and Anna that we studied as the first one. In the first few weeks of Jesus' life, Jesus was brought to the temple, the same place where he is now. Jesus was brought to the temple, and he was praised by a widow. In the last few hours of Jesus' earthly life, he's in the temple again and praises a widow. And we see that Jesus' life, in essence, is bookended by connection to widows. And that they are very, very special to Jesus. From the beginning to the very end of his life. Priority. Now, with those four widows, the lesson from Luke of these widows that matter to God and matter to Jesus is yours. So as we transition and we think about the invitation of Christ, I want to make a little bit of an analogy here based on Ephesians chapter 5, where we learn that as Christians, the bride of Christ, that we are married to Christ. And we know from the very study of this subject about widows that oftentimes that a marriage may be dissolved by the death of a spouse. As we think very specifically about widows, we think about a widow becomes a widow because her husband dies. You and I are married to Christ. We are the bride of Christ. Christ, our husband, will never die. The bride of Christ will never be a widow, because the bridegroom ever lives. Nothing will separate us, because he will never die. Are you married to Christ? Do you need to put on Christ in faith, in obedience, and baptism? Be added to the church, his bride. Be married to Christ. We encourage you. Singing of this song, encouragement of all your brothers and sisters in here. Become a Christian and become one today when you come as we stand and we sing.